With the EOC coming up in 3 weeks, I want to review different modes of writing with you in preparation for the on-demand essay portion of the test. I will be focusing on a different mode each week, and this week we're starting with narrative writing. By the end of this video, you should know not only what narrative writing is, but you should also understand the elements of narrative writing, and you should be prepared to apply this information to an upcoming on-demand writing assignment. So what is a narrative essay anyways? A narrative is a story that has a beginning, middle, and end. The foundation of narrative writing is something that you've probably been introduced to as early as elementary school and middle school. However, the older you get, the more sophisticated and developed your narrative writing should be. This video will give you the tools to ensure that you can pull that off. There will be a slide for each of the 5 different elements you'll need to include when writing your narrative essay. Please take notes on the graphic organizer provided for you. You'll use these notes as a checklist when you write your essay later this week. The beauty of this video is that you are able to go at your own pace, so feel free to pause and rewind as you need to. The first of the 5 elements that I want to discuss with you today is setting. Before writing, it is important to consider where your story will take place. Use sensory and figurative language to paint this picture for the reader so they can feel and see where the story takes place. Writers typically introduce the setting and the exposition of the story. For an on-demand essay, this is going to be your intro paragraph. The physical location of the story is typically the first thing that people think of when it comes to setting. For example, the character in my story is Mrs. Tompkins. She's a teacher in room 114 at Francis Howell Central High School in Cottleville, Missouri. But don't limit yourself to that. Does the fact that the story takes place in 2015 matter? Does the fact that what season it is or what time of day matter in this story? I might include that my story takes place the day students return from spring break and that grades are due at 3. The fact that the year is 2015 means Mrs. Tompkins is able to use Google Docs to collect and grade her students' essays. The fact that it is spring could contribute to why her students are rowdy that day. So when you're writing your story, think about where do you want your story to take place. Before writing your narrative, also consider who will be in your story. You can have multiple characters, but don't include too many because your time for writing this narrative is limited. When introducing your characters, most likely in the intro paragraph, use direct and indirect characterization to develop these characters. Use concrete and sensory language to help readers picture these characters. You can develop characters by describing their actions, their speech using dialogue, their appearance, their thoughts, their interactions with other characters, and how they are perceived by others. For example, what do you know about my fictional character, Miss Tompkins, based on the following? Mrs. Tompkins, a sleep-deprived young woman, slammed her laptop closed and stormed to the front of the boisterous classroom of 10th graders. The students immediately stopped talking, and one student asked, "Miss Tompkins, is it our essays? Are they that bad?" Just those 2 sentences allow readers to know that Miss Tompkins is married, she's a high school teacher, she definitely needs some more sleep, she's frustrated, and her students respect her or care about their essays. So see how much, just in a few sentences, there's so much that you can include when developing your characters. So when writing your essay, think not only about what the setting of the story is going to be and how you can develop it, but also who are the characters and how are you going to develop that. The third element of narrative writing that you're going to include is conflict. Before writing your essay, it is important to consider what conflict your characters will encounter. Before creating a conflict that is too elaborate, keep in mind that this conflict is something that will need to be resolved by the end of the essay. That's something we're going to talk about later in the video. Just like you develop characters and setting, you can also develop conflict. Typically, authors include an inciting incident. This just means that early on, the author is giving clues or introduces this potential conflict that's going to be developing throughout the story. Make sure to include this in the intro paragraph of your on-demand essay. This will intrigue your reader and keep them wanting to read the rest of your story. They'll want to know if and how the problem gets worse and how it will get resolved. For example, in my story, if the conflict is that Mrs. Tompkins' students' grades are due by 3 and the school's Wi-Fi is down, she'll have a problem getting her students' grades off of Google Docs and into the gradebook. By the end of the intro, I would include that her grades are due at 3 and that she can put she hasn't put the essay grades in the gradebook yet. Later in the narrative, I'll add details about how she is busy teaching 1st through 6th hours, so she can't do it then. I'll then add the part about the Wi-Fi going down later in the story. Having no time until 7th hour, plus the Wi-Fi going down, could be the climax of my story. Mrs. Tompkins' problem can't get worse than that, right? The falling action could be that the Wi-Fi comes back on at 2:30, so Mrs. Tompkins only has 30 minutes left to finish her grades. So when developing your story, think about how you can have a strong setting, characters, and conflict. With conflict, there has to be a resolution. So now that you've determined the conflict of your story, it is important that you can plan how the conflict will be resolved. This typically goes in your conclusion paragraph. Your time is limited, so make sure you get to this. You don't want to leave your reader hanging with an unresolved conflict. They need the satisfaction of knowing that this problem has been solved. For example, my readers need to know that Ms. Tompkins submitted her grades in the nick of time. Although the EOC scoring guide doesn't directly mention this in your essay, you might at this point develop a theme. That is something that could naturally become apparent in your conclusion. You don't need to come out and say the moral of the story is, but you can show how the character learned something from his or her experience. So for example, I might add that Mrs. Tompkins realized that she should have put the grades in the gradebook the night before, or she could have just submitted the grades and then put the essays on for 4th quarter. So again, when you are writing your narrative, make sure that you develop a setting, you develop characters, you develop a conflict, and make sure by the end, that conclusion paragraph, you resolve your conflict. Finally, the last thing that you want to consider before writing your story is from what point of view will you be writing from. You know that what the setting is, who the characters are, you know the conflict and how it will be resolved, and now I want you to think about which point of view will help you most effectively tell your story, first person or third person point of view. Both options have their benefits and disadvantages. First person point of view helps readers feel like they are in the story, but it creates a sense of bias. It limits the readers from how other characters think and feel. Third person helps readers objectively know the thoughts and feelings of all characters, but it gives readers that person, but third person doesn't give that personal connection or feeling that they're in the story like first person does. So for example, I'm choosing to write my essay in third person point of view because I want readers to know how the teachers feel, but I also want the reader of my narrative to know how the students feel about the teacher, because I think that'll add more to the plot of my story. Now you've been introduced, you know what a narrative is, you know what these 5 elements of narrative writing is or are, but I want you to also make sure you're prepared for writing your narrative essay later this week and on the EOC. So there's a few more things to keep in mind. There's no rule saying your story has to be real. You might use a life event or something that you've read from a movie, a book, or a TV show as inspiration. So if you see that prompt and you're like, I don't know what to write about, it's okay to make things up. Also consider the stories you've read and make sure you include these elements of things that you really like in a story. It might be the use of dialogue, flashback, foreshadowing. It might be this tone. Maybe you're going to be funny. Maybe you're going to be more serious or sarcastic. It's up to you. You'll have 90 minutes from the time that you get your prompt to the time you're expected to finish writing your narrative. So don't bite off more than you can chew. Make sure your plot and everything you're going to develop is manageable and that you can bring it all in that conclusion by the end of that time. Also, there's no rule saying that your essay has to be 5 paragraphs, but I don't see an essay being shorter than 4 paragraphs getting a very good grade. If they're looking for development of ideas, development of characters and setting and conflict and resolution, in order to do that effectively, you're going to want to make sure that your essay is probably at least 4 paragraphs, and in some cases 5. Here are some example prompts that you might encounter. If you want to pause now and read over these, you can. Notice how these prompts are pretty generic. It's some generic statement followed by a task, then the audience and the topic. They're pretty basic. Typically, students in the past complain about them not being so great. It is your job to think on your feet and create a great story from a bland prompt. For example, the first one asks you to write about your favorite winter memory. I could just tell about this time that I went to see Christmas lights and shopped downtown at Union Station. Although I could tell this in a couple sentences, I need to be able to think on my feet, develop and resolve a conflict in my narrative. I don't remember the exact words spoken between me and my father, but I will have to make those up. Bottom line, don't let the prompt hold you back from being a good storyteller. So this video was intended to help you make sure you know what narrative writing is. You should understand the elements of narrative writing, and you should be prepared to apply these things in a narrative that you're going to be writing on Wednesday and Thursday. So to show your understanding of what narrative writing is based on this video, I want you to create an analogy for narrative writing. So just start with a basic simile. Narrative writing is like blank because, and then explain how these things are similar. So for example, narrative writing is like a good sandwich. Was I hungry when I created this? The beginning of a story is like bread that holds the sandwich together. Bread is important because it needs to be hearty enough to hold together your sandwich, but also needs to be soft and flavorful. Just as your intro and conclusion need to be held together by introducing character, setting, and conflict and wrapping it all up at the end. You don't want to give your readers too much to chew on, so make sure your bread isn't too thick or stale and boring. The meat and the cheese of your story is the conflict and the characters, because it is the focus of your sandwich and the most filling part. Also, a good sandwich has the right condiments and toppings that give your sandwich extra flavor and accentuate the meat and cheese. Just like your use of figurative language, imagery, dialogue, etc., develop the settings, character, and plot. Add your analogy to Schoology and bring your notes to class on Wednesday. You'll pre-write for your narrative essay on Wednesday, and you'll write your own on-demand narrative Thursday. Thanks, guys.